By the way, real quickly, on the disability data, it's an increase in depression. That's one of the real factors. The other is bipolar. What do we know about bipolar? Well, at least in the United States, the prevalence of bipolar has exploded. We're now to about 1 in 50 people is said to be bipolar. If you go to prevalence rates in 1960 in the United States, about 1 in 5,000 adults would have a bipolar episode, so that's a 100-fold increase. If you all were a bipolar group, how many people do we have here today? Let's say there's 100 people. There's more than here today. If we looked at 100 people with a bipolar diagnosis today in the United States, here's the gates you would come through. About 25% would have been doing a lot of illicit drugs before they had their manic episode. Been smoking marijuana every day, doing cocaine or hallucinogens. That'd be one gateway. About 60% would have had their first episode after doing an antidepressant, which SSRIs are known to stir manic episodes, or that's a risk, or have been prescribed a stimulant for ADHD. So literally about 80-85% of people today in the United States anyway, diagnosed with bipolar, which is sort of a mood instability, have been exposed to other psychotropic drugs first. And you're seeing this in every community that I can find which provides data on bipolar and antidepressant use. You're seeing a dramatic increase in bipolar patients. I don't know if you are in Denmark, but you are in Sweden, for example. So, first question, where are all the bipolar coming from? It's because we use so many psychoactive drugs, at least in the U.S. Now, how about outcomes? I will tell you, if you go back, 1969, they said bipolar generally has a fairly benign long-term course. About 50%, you'll recover from your first manic episode, you'll recover from your first depressive episode. About 50% would never be rehospitalized, another 30% would have episodic, 20 would be sort of chronic, 70% or so would be working. There wasn't cognitive impairment, so it was seen as a difficult disorder, but nevertheless episodic. These are the three leading sort of researchers on the course of bipolar today. What do you see? Here's the head of mood disorders in the NIMH. In the era prior to pharmacotherapy, poor outcome in mania was considered a relatively rare occurrence. Modern outcome studies have found that a majority of patients now have a lot of functional impairment. This is Ross Baldessarini, is this famous person I've been talking about. What does he say? Prognosis for bipolar disorder is once considered relatively favorable. This is my favorite line. But contemporary findings suggest that disability and poor outcomes are prevalent, despite major therapeutic advances. And then finally, Fred Goodwin is the former director of the NIMH. He's written a couple textbooks on bipolar. And you'll see here, what are we seeing today? You can see in this modern era, we're seeing more rapid cycling, more mixed states, more failure. The illness is not what was originally described. So with bipolar, you have a twofold whammy. You have basically a drug entrance to that diagnosis, and then our outcomes are getting worse than they were 30 years ago. Here's my summary, I think, of why as societies we should be thinking about this. One, the burden of mental illness is going up. Two, when we look about what the drugs do, you see this problem of oppositional tolerance come up. And three, can the drugs help people over the short term? Sure. And they basically meet some standard of short-term efficacy. Do some people do well on them long-term? Sure, of course. And they'll say, you know, they saved my life, which is great, fantastic. But what is the research telling us about how they shape outcomes in the aggregate from a societal point of view? And I think what you see here today is at the very least this one-size-fits-all is not justified by the research literature. That's one. Two, there's a good message here is that in fact in nature there's often a lot of resilience to recover from a psychiatric episode, and we need to remember that and nurture it. And I do think three is, if you take awareness of this literature, you actually want to try to minimize, if possible, long-term use. And that's what I love about the Finnish program. That's what they've done. They haven't thrown the medications completely out, but they've developed a best use model that is really leading to better outcomes. So that's the story really told about adults in anatomy of an epidemic. And I think, that was 4 years ago. And here's what I've learned about it since. I've seen no data come forth that contradicts these worries. Instead, what you see is new things, Herald data, the Riefel-Malek about tardive dysphoria, the Australian study about medication compliance, some of the people like the Bochting study from the Netherlands saying, we may be causing these biological changes. If anything, it's strengthened the data around these themes. And on an intellectual level, I've seen, say, psychiatrists, psychiatric researchers respond to this. So, for example, I've been asked to give grand rounds at certain medical schools. And they'll say, yeah. But boy, have I seen no willingness to make wholesale societal change. Instead, it's like, at some point, it seems like authority asserts itself, usual standards of care assert itself. You can read absolutely nasty things about me. And if this data is right, it means that we have a form of care that's doing a lot of harm. And especially if we start thinking about kids, which is where we'll finish up in later. Okay, thank you.